We now have Professor Jocelyn Alexander, Learning and Responsibility Among War Generations in One Soldier's Life Story.
Thank you very much, Deacon. Though I'm going to disappoint you as well in the sense that I'm only going to be talking about war generations in exile. So we won't get any chimbitos or logistics experts involved in this story either. But I'm sure we can come on to that. Yeah, thanks very much. So this is a part of a bigger study that I'm doing with Joanne McGregor on military training and military culture in exile. So this is I'm going to focus on just one interview that comes out of that research, which we've been doing for a couple of years now and starting to sort of pull together a little bit. It also draws on some ideas about Zipra history being developed by the Bulawayo historian Patisa Enyati, who will be familiar to many of you here and with whom Joanne and I have both been working. His approach to Zipra history tries to kind of create a structure for storytelling by seeing it as the product of different generations over some 2 decades, each defined by differences in recruitment, in tactics and weaponry, in places of training, and in sheer numbers. So he asks, how do you go from throwing rocks and training homegrown saboteurs to launching Strela missiles and training MiG pilots in the Soviet Union? How do you go from a handful of dragoon recruits in Zambia to the thousands and thousands of recruits who passed through Nampundu camp each year in 1977? It's an eye-opening way of thinking about the war, and it favors a kind of military point of view. So I want to think a little bit about war generations from one man's point of view through one story in order to explore how it shaped learning and, in fact, teaching across these generations. So I'm going to draw on a couple of very lengthy interviews that I did with Patisa last summer with a Zipra veteran, widely hailed all through the streets of central Bulawayo by the name of Tonderai. His real name is Cetshwayo Sithole. His war name is Tonderai Ngoma. The men hailing him in the streets, and I didn't have to walk more than about a block with him before we were stopped by someone or other, were fellow veterans who had first met him in his role as a military instructor in Nampundu camp in Zambia. Many thousands of young men had in fact passed through his hands between 1977 and 1979, and they remembered him well. It was actually a fascinating kind of way of experiencing how communities of memory kind of sustain themselves on a daily basis through these sorts of interactions in the street. In fact, Joe and I have interviewed many of the men who'd gone through Tonderai's hands over the years and had heard stories time and again about the training regime in Nampundu, which was every recruit's first port of call in the second half of the 1970s. The regime was usually portrayed as a thoroughly shocking introduction to military ways. These stories were sometimes told with humor, sometimes with horror, sometimes with real anger and hurt, but always with an incredible kind of vividness. So it was, of course, a source of tremendous interest for us to learn more about the origins of this punishing regime. And I was a bit nervous to meet Tonderai after everything we'd heard sort of about what he'd done to all these young men, from their perspective. So to understand the Nampundu regime, we need first to situate Tonderai's own war generation. He crossed into Botswana and from there by plane to Zambia in 1975, part of a wave of recruits excited by news of war and by the release of the detained nationalist leaders. As in the case of subsequent generations, his first port of call was Nampundu camp. But the camp was not then Zapu's alone. It was rather a kind of holding camp run by the Zambian army, along with a Mbaroma camp, for young men who saw themselves as Zanu or as Zapu, and on whom UANC was also making a claim. Tonderai described the frustrations of waiting in the camp during these, quote, political squabbles, up until someone he called a rascal among his group made a dash in an emergency taxi for Lusaka to alert the Zapu hierarchy of their presence. They didn't even know that they were there. Shortly thereafter, all those identified as Zapu in both Mbaroma and Nampundu were sent to open up a military training camp at Mwembeshi in a rugged part of eastern Zambia. This cohort formed a famous generation in Zipra known as the Group of 800, a very large, which was, of course, their number. And it was at that time, in 1975, a very large number that easily dwarfed previous cohorts in Zipra. The instructors at Mwembeshi had among their number famed characters, and these are characters that are spoken of throughout Zipra, such as Sam Madondo and Stanley and Leah. And the guerrilla training regime there was, in Tonderai's recollection, extremely rigorous and demanding. There was, he recalled, a sense of intense danger behind this, owing to the external pressure to join forces with Zanla, as would indeed happen with the establishment of Zipra, the sort of combining of Zanla and Zipra together later that same year, as well as the possibility of Rhodesian attack. In fact, just 3 or 4 months into their training, Mwembeshi was shut down, and the group of 800 was forced to board trucks and to join Zanla trainees at Mgagao in Tanzania. The outcome of the move to Mgagao was well known, if still obviously highly controversial in parts. The reception of the Zipra trainees at the camp was unremittingly hostile from the moment of their arrival and culminated in the so-called Mgagao massacre, in which about 50 ZAPU trainees were killed. This event is among the most bitter in Zipra narratives of the liberation struggle, owing to what was portrayed as Chinese and Tanzanian connivance with Zanla in the gunning down of unarmed Zipra cadres. And I won't go into the details here. It's safe to say that Tonderai took 2 lessons from this experience. The first was that those who survived did so because of the discipline of their commanders and the rigor of the training they had undergone in Mwembeshi. As Tonderai explained, in Mgagao, we had actually seen the war. We'd just gone past a terrible battle that you could see somebody being shot down straight in a war, but unarmed. You could get into the crossfire. You know, the obstacle crossing that we underwent while we were at Mwembeshi. It made us know how to crawl. Put your head down and crawl. If that had not been the case, the Chinese could have wiped out almost everybody. We crawled, and they couldn't believe, because Sam Madondo, Stanley and Leah, once they fired, down, up, roll, crawl, it was as if it was just a fictitious film that was actually happening practically. It was what we'd done in training, but now in real combat, and we were so comfortable with that. And it made us survive. It really made us survive. This experience conditioned Tonderai's own attitude to the completion of his guerrilla training in Morogoro in Tanzania, a regime that was, in his view, even more demanding than Mwembeshi had been, and was again led by some of Zipra's most legendary figures, including P.V. Sabanda, who's of course now the commander of Zimbabwe's defense forces, and Chilean Leah, who's the most senior surviving Zipra commander. But its rigors now made eminent sense. They had become tolerable. They were about surviving war. The second lesson of Mgagao was loyalty. It was a lesson that Tonderai had, in fact, already learned in less terrifying circumstances in Nampundu and in Botswana. One had to maintain one's loyalty to ZAPU in the face of the efforts of foreign powers and hosts to force a new allegiance, whether that be to ZANU or to the UANC or to ZIPA. This message had been powerfully articulated in the visits of ZAPU's leaders, notably J.Z. Moyo to Mwembeshi, and in the aftermath of Mgagao at Morogoro. And it was further ingrained in political lessons taught by Zipra's political commissars. Tonderai's return to Zambia in January 1977 coincided with the assassination of J.Z. Moyo, another moment of upheaval that was felt particularly keenly by military cadres, among whom he was extraordinarily popular. Tonderai's return also coincided with a massive increase in the flow of people across Zimbabwe's borders into Zambia. Tonderai was sent back to Nampundu camp, where his job was now to provide military instruction to those arriving who were deemed fit for military training. He believed he'd been chosen for this crucial role because of the qualities of loyalty, discipline, and independence he had exhibited, signs of his own rapid maturation within this war generation. A Zipra syllabus was provided, but Tonderai and his fellow instructors, many of whom were also members of the group of 800, also developed their own methods. So let me pause just for a moment to stress the enormity of this task in Nampundu. In 1977 alone, probably over 10,000 civilians entered the camp. The young men deemed fit for military training were to be prepared to be sent to other camps and training sites where they would receive advanced instruction, much of it in conventional warfare. Of these, 2,000 men went to the Cuban and Soviet-run camps in Angola, 2,000 to Ethiopia, and 2,000 to the Zambian Army-run training center at Mulungushi, while thousands more went to the 3 main Zipra-run training camps in Zambia, and smaller numbers were sent for more specialized training further afield. Nampundu had become a port of entry and exit for an army that entirely dwarfed the group of 800 of just a year and a half earlier, and marked the emergence of a vastly larger and very differently equipped set of war generations. Tondrai's job was to create order out of the mass of people in Namkunda and prepare them for their move into advanced training, much of it in foreign hands. He considered it his duty to, on the one hand, deliver to foreign hosts and instructors men who would be trainable, that is, men who were fit and disciplined. He wanted to impress foreign trainers and to make the very best use of them. On the other hand, he wanted to ensure that these young men remained loyal to Zapu and that they could be smoothly reintegrated into Zipra on their return. That is, that they did not become too different. You don't want someone, as he put it, to come back a Bulgarian or show signs of pomposity. This meant building a shared foundation of military training and ensuring a shared political understanding of the struggle. Tandrai spoke of cooking, baking, and molding recruits. He stressed the importance of, quote, the level of discipline, the level of cooperation, the level of accepting instruction from somebody different, while at the same time not undermining the extent to which such men would be commendable within Zipra on their return. In aid of these goals, Tandrai and his colleagues invented a method of rapidly converting the diverse mix of civilians flooding into the camp into what he called controllable men. They instituted a ritual of induction known among Zipra cadres far and wide, and again about which Joe and I had heard many times, as meeting the old man. The old man, of course, being Zapu President Jocelyn. Recruits believed that they would indeed be welcomed by their political hero. They dressed in their best clothes, and they hurried to the rocky hill where he was to meet them. They were instead met by military instructors who forced them to run up and down the hill, rolling and crawling in the mud on command without respite for hours on end. Complaint and excuse was not tolerated. This was for many a first shocking experience of the exercise of military authority, which was, of course, exactly what it was intended to be. Tandrai explained this practice with reference to his own training. Quote, "You have to have had that experience that we went through as recruits. There is no way you can just control a refugee or somebody who's just coming from home. How do you control him if you don't mold him into a formation that is controllable? So we devised a plan. We devised a system that as people come, maybe they have just arrived from Francistown in the morning, they must go and welcome Joshua and Como. The experience at the hill that followed demonstrated the necessity of, as he put it, adhering to instructions, which is a very benign version. Quote, these are methods of trying to remove someone from a civilian life and introduce that somebody into military life. This exercise was followed by the introduction of a tightly regimented program of exercise in political classes and the organization of recruits into platoons within which they constituted their own responsible command structures. This was, Tandrai held, so that at least you are introduced into a system that will make you know you are in a war zone. Grasping this was essential to survival, a lesson Tandrai had himself had to learn. Guerrilla war, he explained, does not have a front. The war is everywhere, wherever you are, in Tanzania, Zambia, Angola, and Zimbabwe. In the last years of the war, of course, the Zambian camps were repeatedly subject to Rhodesian attack and bombing. They were, quote, fixed visible spaces, and hence vulnerable. For Tandrai's generation, born of the turmoil of Detente, Muzirewa, and Zipa, the violence of Ngagao, and the rigors of Morogoro, the most profound lesson lay in the importance of the, quote, molding process of military training as protection against threats that were not yet knowable. Tandrai was keenly aware of the difficulties and contradictions inherent in this process, which was at once brutal and intended to ensure survival. As he put it with some ambiguity, our wish is that everyone must see an independent Zimbabwe. We are not here to die. We did not choose to die, but we're fighting for our rights. And as such, we're trying as much as possible that we must survive, especially some of us who were victims of the horror in Ngagao and the other places. We could tell the recruits that some of your brothers who we were with were lost, and what made us survive is our strong training. It's not that somebody would be hurting you in training, but somebody would like you to survive difficult circumstances. So it was, I'm going to finish with that. So it was in that way that one war generation prepared another war generation for war itself.
Thank you very much. How do you go from using catapults to operating a MiG? That was the situation encountered again in 1980. How do you build a country with people coming from the bush who know nothing? When I came from the bush, I didn't even know a tea bag. When I got my first chance to use a tea bag, I looked around and said, how do I use this? How do you build a country, in those circumstances? But you begin to say again, intergenerational mobility. By 83, I was operating a computer, doing programming with basic, doing geomorphology models. So there was progression. I won't take your time, sir.